Most people think loneliness is the enemy, that being alone means something's wrong, that if no one's texting you, if you're not constantly surrounded by noise, attention, or praise, then you must be failing at life. But what if the exact opposite is true? Carl Jung believed that solitude wasn't a punishment. It was a portal, a necessary passageway into the deepest parts of the self. In a world addicted to connection, stimulation, and validation, solitude is radical and uncomfortable because when you're alone, everything you've been suppressing begins to rise. There's no one left to perform for, no distractions to hide behind, no audience to shape your identity around. It's just you, raw, unfiltered, and painfully real. And that's why most people run from solitude, not because it's boring, but because it's honest. It shows you what you've been avoiding, the inner noise, the confusion, the shame, the fear, and underneath all of it, the question you've been too busy to ask: who am I when no one's watching? Jung believed that every individual had two selves: the persona, the mask we wear for the world, and the self, the deeper, often hidden truth of who we are. Most of us live in the mask. We learn early on how to be liked, how to be safe, how to be successful. We become performers, adapting our behavior to meet expectations. But in solitude, the performance ends, and that's where the work begins. Because solitude strips away everything that isn't essential. It confronts you with your beliefs, your wounds, your ego. It asks, is this really you, or just who you thought you had to be? This confrontation can feel brutal. That's why the first instinct is to escape. We pick up our phones, we scroll, we fill the silence, we try to outrun the truth, but solitude waits. It doesn't demand answers, it creates space for them. And slowly, in the quiet, something shifts. You begin to hear a different voice, not the critic, not the crowd, not the echo of culture, but your own. Faint at first, but real. That's where identity begins, not in noise, but in stillness, not in applause, but in presence. And Jung knew this. Until you spend time in solitude, you'll never meet your true self. Because your true self doesn't scream to be seen, it whispers, and solitude is the only place quiet enough to hear it. It's easy to confuse solitude with loneliness, but they're not the same. Loneliness is the absence of others. Solitude is the presence of yourself. One drains you, the other rebuilds you, but only if you're willing to stay with it, past the discomfort, past the itch to escape. Because at first, solitude doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like withdrawal. Your mind races, your habits scream. You'll do anything to avoid the silence. But stay with it long enough, and something unexpected happens. Clarity, not the kind that arrives all at once, like lightning, but the slow, unfolding kind. The kind that shows you patterns you've lived by for years without even knowing. You begin to notice how often your thoughts are reactions, how much of your energy is spent performing, how little time you've spent just being. Carl Jung believed that most suffering stems from the disconnection between who we truly are and who we pretend to be. And in solitude, that disconnection becomes obvious. You feel the distance between the life you live and the life you want, between the roles you play and the soul underneath. That's where shadow work begins, not in books, not in therapy rooms, but in silence. Because solitude brings your shadow to the surface, the parts of you you've repressed, the memories you've buried, the desires you've denied. They all come up, not to torment you, but to be seen, to be integrated. Jung taught that wholeness doesn't come from becoming perfect. It comes from becoming real. And you can't be real until you stop running. Solitude forces that confrontation, not as punishment, but as a path to authenticity. It teaches you to sit with your own energy, to be enough without performance, to validate your own existence without applause. At first, it feels like nothing is happening, but what's really happening is everything. You're reclaiming your mind. You're peeling away the layers of conditioning, expectation, and fear. You're allowing the false identities to fall apart, and in their place, your true self begins to emerge, not as an idea, but as a felt presence, stable, still, undeniable. This is why solitude is sacred. It doesn't just reveal who you are, it frees who you are. Modern life teaches us to fear silence. We fill every gap with sound, with stimulation, with distraction, anything but stillness. And yet, Carl Jung knew that silence is the threshold, the gateway between surface and depth. Because when there's no one else to impress, no role to perform, no noise to hide behind, you're finally left with the only person who matters in this work, you. But here's the uncomfortable truth. When most people meet themselves in solitude, they don't like what they find. Not because they're bad, but because they're strangers. They've spent so much time becoming what others wanted them to be, they forgot how to be who they are. So when the masks fall, all that's left is unfamiliar territory, a landscape they've never explored. And like all unfamiliar territory, it feels dangerous at first. This is why so many run from solitude. They're not afraid of being alone. They're afraid of seeing who they've become when no one else is watching. But Jung believed this fear was necessary. In fact, he called it the beginning of real transformation. Because what's buried in that fear isn't shame, it's power. Your repressed desires, your forgotten strengths, your disowned intuition. All of it waits quietly, under the noise, under the persona, under the expectations. And solitude is the only environment where these things can rise without judgment, without filters, without performance, just you and the mirror of silence. And yes, it's intense. It can be deeply uncomfortable. But here's the paradox. The more time you spend in solitude, the less alone you feel, because you start to connect with something deeper than social approval. You connect with yourself, not your ego, not your curated self, your real self, the one that existed before the world told you who to be, the self that doesn't need a spotlight to feel seen, that doesn't need applause to feel worthy. This self doesn't scream, it doesn't chase, it waits, and when you give it space, through solitude, it begins to speak, through feelings, through intuition, through a quiet knowing that doesn't come from the outside. That's the gift of solitude. It teaches you how to belong to yourself, not as a backup plan, not as a lonely fallback, but as the foundation of your life. Because when you know who you are in solitude, no one can define you. And when you can be fully with yourself without needing to escape, you stop seeking people to complete you. You start choosing people who match you. And that changes everything. If this reflection speaks to you, consider subscribing to Depthora and turning on notifications so we can keep going inward together. Here's what no one tells you about the journey inward. It's not about feeling better. It's about becoming whole. Carl Jung didn't believe in fixing people. He believed in integrating them, the light and the shadow, the joy and the grief, the confidence and the doubt. All of it belongs. But in everyday life, we're taught to curate, to show only the parts that are acceptable, polished, and impressive. We hide the rest. And over time, we start believing that the parts we hide are bad, weak, flawed. But solitude doesn't play by those rules. It brings everything to the surface, the good, the broken, the confusing, and in doing so, it gives you the one thing society never will, a chance to accept yourself as a whole, not as a brand, not as an identity, but as a full, complex, living being. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, not who your parents wanted, not who the world rewards, who you are. And that kind of becoming doesn't happen in crowds. It happens in quiet moments of solitude, when you start to make peace with the parts of yourself you once rejected, when you look at your insecurity and say, "You're allowed to be here," when you meet your sadness with presence, not panic, When you let go of the need to constantly do and finally allow yourself to be, that's what solitude teaches. It doesn't erase your wounds. It creates space to hold them without judgment. And slowly, that space becomes strength. You learn that stillness isn't emptiness, it's depth. And in that depth, you find treasures you didn't know you had. Clarity, resilience, a quiet kind of power. Not the kind that dominates others, but the kind that anchors you, that allows you to move through life from a place of alignment, not approval. And the more time you spend in that space, the more your external world begins to shift. Not because you force it, but because when you change the relationship you have with yourself, everything else follows. You stop chasing, you stop proving, you stop settling for connections that don't feel real. Because once you've learned how to be with yourself fully, you're no longer afraid to walk alone. Let's get honest, solitude isn't always beautiful. Sometimes it feels like falling apart. The emotions you buried under busy schedules, they rise. The pain you ignored while chasing validation, it surfaces. The silence you tried to escape for years, it surrounds you. And it's overwhelming, but that's not failure, that's healing. Carl Jung taught that the psyche is self-regulating, that when we stop distracting ourselves, the unconscious begins to speak, not through words, but through images, sensations, and patterns. And often, the first thing it shows us is our wounds, the parts of us we abandoned, the feelings we never allowed ourselves to feel. But in solitude, you can finally stop running from them. You can sit with the fear, let the anger breathe, let the grief be seen, not to fix it immediately, but to honor it. That's what changes you. Because healing isn't about getting rid of pain, it's about creating space for it to exist without controlling you. And the deeper you go into that space, the more you uncover what's underneath the pain. Truth, power, peace. Not the peace that comes from comfort, but the peace that comes from wholeness. From no longer having to hide parts of yourself just to survive. Jung believed that true transformation doesn't come from suppressing the shadow, but from integrating it. And solitude gives you the chance to do just that. Not in one day, not with a single meditation, but moment by moment, choosing to stay with yourself instead of abandoning yourself. That's the essence of self-trust. Not believing everything will be fine, but believing you can hold whatever comes up and still remain whole. And here's the shift. Once you experience that kind of solitude, the kind where you meet yourself fully, you stop needing constant external input. You don't need endless stimulation. You don't need to be constantly seen. You're no longer afraid of silence because you've been in it and you've realized it didn't destroy you. It revealed you. And once that happens, life begins to slow down, not in a boring way, but in a grounded way. You make choices more deliberately. You listen more deeply. You speak less, but with more weight. You stop performing. You start being. And in that being, something sacred emerges. You start to feel at home, not in the world, but in yourself. So what now? You've seen what solitude can uncover. You've felt the resistance, the discomfort, and the clarity that lives on the other side. Now the question becomes, can you stay with yourself? Not just when it's peaceful, but when it's raw, when it's quiet, when no one's watching. Carl Jung believed that a fulfilled life isn't built by becoming someone else. It's built by remembering who you've always been. And solitude is the process of remembering. It's where the illusions fall away, where the conditioning fades, where the soul speaks clearly. But here's the thing, no one can walk that path for you. It's a solitary road by design, not because you're meant to be alone forever, but because until you know how to walk alone, every connection will be built on fear, fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of being truly seen. But when you've sat with yourself in solitude, When you've met the shadows and heard your own voice without noise, you stop fearing intimacy, because you're no longer dependent on others to define your worth. You don't chase relationships to feel whole, you choose them to share your wholeness. That's the power of solitude. It doesn't isolate you from the world, it reconnects you to it through a deeper version of you. A self that isn't reacting, isn't performing, isn't hiding. A self that is quiet, clear, and unshakable. That self doesn't shout, it doesn't demand to be seen. It simply exists, rooted, present, real. And when you live from that place, everything changes. You become less interested in distraction, less attached to chaos, less afraid of being alone, because you've already been there, and you didn't just survive it. You grew from it. You came home in it. You became you in it. So if you feel the pull towards solitude, follow it. Even if it scares you, even if it feels strange, especially then, because the truth is, you're not missing anything out there. You've just been missing yourself. And now, in this silence, you're finally listening.